bloc governments, Western European governments. And I presented at that time what I presented as the alternative to Kissinger's policy. This is the policy which became known as Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, the important thing is to understand what the original SDI was, contrary to the idiocy which you hear in the press today about missile defense, which what you hear in the press is idiocy by people who are worse than idiots. They don't know anything about missile defense. So what we have to do is something completely different. We do have the ability to devise systems, new kinds of physical systems, which could deal effectively with thermonuclear missiles. That is, render them effectively technologically obsolete down the line. But that was not the extent of my proposal. The proposal was that instead of having the Soviet Union and the United States engaged in this crazy chicken game called SALT I and ABM, why don't we find a way out of the conflict itself? How? Because the Soviet economy, like the US economy, is collapsing. The present policies of the US economy, the present policies of the Soviet economy ensure a collapse of those economies, physical collapse. So why don't we change the policy? Why don't we go back to the space program of Kennedy? And let's do what we proved with Kennedy. Remember, according to the estimates which were made in the middle of the 1970s, the United States got more than a dime of additional GNP out of every penny the United States invested in the space program, the Kennedy space program. The point is that since increases in productivity come directly only from improvements in technology derived from fundamental scientific discoveries, the higher the rate you convert fundamental physical discoveries into practice, the greater the rate of increase of productivity per capita of population and per square kilometer of area. The problem of both the Soviet system and our own, though in different degrees, I said at the time, was that the United States was not generating a rate of net growth in physical productivity sufficient to maintain the economy. Therefore, we needed a program for forced draft, science-driven, technological progress with some mission, like the moon mission, but as a byproduct of that mission, such as the moon mission, we would generate spillovers in terms of technological progress by such a crash program to put the United States economy back on the plus side in terms of net growth. The Soviet economy does not work for similar reasons, different but similar reasons. Therefore, if the Soviet Union, with its vast military, scientific, technological capability, were to put that capability in cooperation with us in global technological progress, and if we focused upon developing countries, South America, Africa, Asia, to do what Roosevelt proposed be done for these countries had he not died, then the benefit of such a program would put the two things. Would put the two economies back on the plus side together with Europe. And it would also be a way of creating a global agenda which would solve the conflict problem. Now that was the SDI, the original form, which is what Reagan proposed on March 23rd, 1983 in his television broadcast. Nothing else. Later, to the Heritage Foundation and other clowns, that definition of SDI was sabotaged and destroyed. Now, we did the same thing later, coming out of '85. We had a friend of ours who died, Kraft Erika, who was a leading space scientist, first for Germany, then for the United States. And he had become a friend of ours. When he died of cancer, Helga, my wife, organized a conference sponsored by others for him. So as part of this thing, we put our heads together. What would we do at a conference? We're going to get his friends from all over the world and so forth, and other interested people involved. We had this conference in Virginia, in Reston. What would we do? And I said, well, let's take what he wanted to do and go a step further. Now, Kraft Erika's key favorite project was the automatic industrialization of the moon. And he was the man who had been working on the project in the 1950s and later for the industrial development of the moon, with the idea that the moon would be developed as Kraft Erika and others had proposed also. The moon would be developed as a base, an industrial base on which we would build much of the weight of the spacecraft we'd use to explore the solar system more extensively. So I said, why not go the next step? This was Kraft's project. He laid out a project very well defined. It's one thing to honor it. Let's do something more. Let's go to Mars. So what I did was to take the base work that Kraft had done and others had done, and simply took this and said, here's the obvious. Here's why we have to go to colonize Mars, not to build housing development on Mars, not that sort of thing, but to create a Los Alamos-type science city under the surface of Mars, which would be a base for general beyond Mars space exploration into the universe generally. To get away from the sun, because the sun is a very noisy place, and you can't see things or hear things clearly with all that noise of this big sun rumbling around up there. So if you get a bit further out, at a place with a much thinner atmosphere, you build a science base out there, and you use that as a base from which to deploy other pieces of equipment into Mars nearby space. Then you can conduct observations of the universe, which we can't do from Earth. We can do them. We can get into frequencies and so forth we otherwise can't get into. And this was, but I said the reason for doing this, it would be fairly estimated it would take us 40 years to get a landing on Mars under these kinds of conditions. So let's do it. Why? Because of the spin-off benefits of the science driver project needed to make it in 40 years. It may take you 40 years to get to Mars, but you're going to get a lot of benefits on Earth from the technological spillover in the short run.
Now, that LaRouche proposal was a proposal for the physical economy of the globe to become extraterrestrial. The economic platform of the world, as is evident by the proliferation of satellites and the use of satellites in everything virtually in the world economy today, is no longer located merely on the surface of the planet, but is now and has been for decades extraterrestrial. From the time of LaRouche's proposal in 1983, all other proposals with respect to physical economy that did not take the issue of space development as the core of a science driver for world economy, were out of date. And the physical collapse of the United States has never been reversed, though there have been some derivative increases in productivity in certain sectors of the economy and improvements in computerization and miniaturization and so on. The United States has been at a continuous accelerating state of physical economic decay for about 50 years, and anyone that travels on the streets of New York City or many other cities of the United States knows that. The war for the soul of the United States, in fact, has to be won by the patriots of the United States. Yes, there has been a withdrawal from the Paris Accords. Yes, there had been a temporary stop to war, but of course we now see something new, something different occurring. And more importantly, it's important for us to try to give Americans a sense of what the historical problem actually is, of what we refer to as, or is referred to as, the global strategic policy, American geopolitical strategy, these other terms, noise phrases largely. Yesterday was the 75th anniversary of the infamous Fulton, Missouri speech by Sir Winston Churchill, sometimes referred to as the Iron Curtain speech. And what we're going to do is to refer to a few sections of that speech to give an idea of what has caused the 75-year confusion with some instances of departure, such as Eisenhower's 1957 challenge of the British Suez or Kennedy's challenge to everyone with his Apollo program. but there's been more or less a continuous disorientation of Americans since that time of the Fulton, Missouri speech. So we're going to reference a few of the sections of that speech right now. So I figure I have the first slide. This is from the beginning of the speech. We cannot be blind. This is Winston Churchill. He's speaking. He's been introduced by President Harry Truman at Westminster College in Missouri. We cannot be blind to the fact that the liberties enjoyed by individual citizens throughout the British Empire are not valid in a considerable number of countries, some of which are very powerful. But we must never cease to proclaim in fearless tones the great principles of freedom and the rights of man, which are the joint inheritance of the English-speaking world, and which through Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights, the habeas corpus, trial by jury, and the English common law find their most famous expressions in the American Declaration of Independence. Now, let me simply say that that is a fallacy of composition, if ever there was one. There's actually no relationship whatsoever between the American Declaration of Independence and what is referred to here as English common law. Further, Churchill, to be expected, completely keeps out the idea of the influence of the United States Constitution of Leibniz. He went on to say, neither the sure prevention of war nor the continuous rise of world organization, meaning the United Nations in this case, will be gained without what I have called the fraternal association of the English-speaking people. This means a special relationship between the British Commonwealth and Empire and the United States. And that is the origin of the term special relationship, a term you'll hear repeated, unfortunately, by every American president. It comes from this speech in 1946. And now we'll come to the famous passage, which people probably have heard, as was referred to as the Iron Curtain passage, in which he said, from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe. Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in many cases increasing measure of control from Moscow. Now, I just want people to note that that was what used to be defined as the border of NATO. Now we hear that NATO is at the border of Norway, or it's at the border of Lithuania. And now we're also hearing about the possibility of the creation of a global NATO, a NATO in the Pacific, and other locations where the Atlantic Ocean clearly doesn't belong. Last time we noticed or checked, the Atlantic Ocean was not the Pacific Ocean. These ideas and the legacy of this Churchillian imperial reflex has been what has haunted the United States since that time, and in specific is what characterizes the now dead-on arrival Great Reset, which is a hopelessly doomed policy, which may in fact take many nations out with it. Now, what we want to do today is to offer you an analysis, a discussion, and a background on the way in which this policy has brought ruin not merely to the United States, but the entire transatlantic world. And so what we're going to do is we're going to begin with Claudio Celani from Europe, and specifically from our Italian organization and sphere, who's going to discuss the view from Europe on these matters, and he'll be followed by Harley Schlanger. So, Claudio?
Hi, hello to everybody. Can you hear me?
Yes, you're very clear.
Okay, should I start?
Yes.
Okay, let me tell you a little bit what's going on here in Europe, in the European Union, which I think is a good pedagogical object to study for an American public to see how the oligarchical rule looks like, which is it's clearer if you watch it from the outside, if you watch it in Europe, than in America for many reasons. But we are now in a situation in Europe where the strategy against the COVID-19 pandemics has totally failed. Now, if you think that 1 year after the breakout of the pandemics, a country like China has not only defeated the pandemics, but it's going through an economic recovery, and it has succeeded in bringing down poverty during the year of pandemics. That is, while they were going into a lockdown for 2 months in Wuhan, they were mobilizing to bring in medical doctors and equipment and gear up the production for this, invest money in the vaccination, testing people, etc., etc. While they were doing all this, they have reduced poverty and they have eliminated poverty, as it was announced by the government recently. Now, what we have in Europe is exactly the opposite. We are now 1 year after the breakout of the pandemic. We are experiencing the entail of the second wave, or many say it's the third wave already, where in some regions of Europe, the same situation is being reproduced, the same dramatic situation with hospitals overwhelmed and people getting sick and dying, like in February, March of last year. So we are not at all out of the pandemic, and the vaccination campaign has started, basically not started, it started very low, and it's not going anywhere. I mean, I give you one figure, for example. If you compare what's done in Europe on the vaccination campaign with United States or Britain or Israel, I think here in Europe we have something like 8 people on over 100 people have been vaccinated. I think we have over 20 in the United States. We have 95 in Israel. And the reason why this has failed, and if it goes on like this, it takes 2 or 3 years to vaccinate the population. So this has created tremendous backlash, political backlash, a total rage in the population, in the medical profession, etc. But the reason why this is taking place is because it has been decided that the vaccination campaign is being coordinated centrally for all member countries of the European Union by the European Commission. And this was a total ideological decision. That is, the leaders of the European Union have seen this as an opportunity to promote their system, their political system, which is the build-up of the European Commission and the institutions of the European Union as a real superstate with all the powers of the superstate. So they saw this as a golden opportunity to take more power. And what they did nothing, because they said, okay, now we give money to the private industry, the free market, and then the free market will take care of providing enough vaccinations. Now, the free market did not provide enough vaccinations. There are not enough vaccines for the European population. And in almost all countries of the member countries of the European Union, preparations have been made, people have been mobilized, structures have been built for a mass vaccine campaign, and people cannot go on vaccinate because there are not enough vaccines. And the companies which had, like Pfizer, like AstraZeneca, which the European Commission had signed a contract with, they suddenly say, oh, we can't deliver all the vaccines we promised. We can give you only half of that, etc., etc. Now, in addition to this, the European Commission, also for ideological reasons, has stubbornly refused to even consider to use the Russian and the Chinese vaccines. Now, you can understand maybe at the beginning you are skeptical because you say, well, we don't have enough evidence that the vaccine, Russian vaccine and the Chinese vaccine fulfill all the requirements. But now, after these vaccines have been used, and by empirical result, you can say that these vaccines work very well. There is no reason why offers from Russia and China should not be accepted, because the population is the pandemic is spreading and the population is dying. But for ideological reasons or geopolitical reasons, the European Commission has blocked this. Now, finally, under pressure of public opinion and the medical professions and the people in general, they have decided, now they've moved formally, they say that they will now check and go evaluate under the European Medical Authority the Russian vaccines. But this has now, created a situation where, as I said at the beginning, some regions are experiencing in Europe an almost collapse of hospital and medical structure. So we need to change the situation very, very quick. Now, the good news is that this fiasco has damaged a lot politically the leadership of the European Union. That's good for us because this means that it will not be so easy for them in the next period to go ahead with all the rest of their policies. And with this, I mean the Great Reset policies that Dennis mentioned before. Now, but what is the European Union? Why did they do this? As I said, they went, they thought, let's use the free market approach. But more important was the political decision of seeing this as an opportunity to carry forward their project of building up a supranational state. The original idea of the European Union is that this should become a supranational state able to confront the United States, Russia, and China. Now, where does this come from? This is an old idea. It comes, if you want, from the very idea of H.G. Wells, the British intelligence agent and writer, who wrote a book in 1933, I believe, called "The Shape of Things to Come." This can be seen as a manifesto of the strategy of the British Empire to perpetuate itself in a new form that is no longer with the British flag as an empire based on a nation, but as a world government based on a financial power whose center was and is the city of London. And the European Union has been born on the basis of this ideology, on the basis of the ideology that the nation state is obsolete, on the wrong statement on the fallacy of composition that the nation state has provoked wars in history, which is totally wrong. It's false. As a matter of fact, it's empires which have provoked wars, but not the nation state. And on the basis of this idea, after the Second World War, under the influence and the direction of the British, the foundations of the European Union were laid. Now, this went on in several stages until 1989, and when in 1989 the Berlin Wall fell and the communist system collapsed in Russia and in Eastern Europe, then it was decided that to prevent an integration, a physical integration and cooperation between post-communist countries, Russia and Eastern Europe, and Western Europe, especially Germany. It was decided to make a leap forward and go to the what we see today as the euro system, the introduction of a supranational currency. This was the decision to take away fully monetary sovereignty, economic sovereignty from European countries and establish this power into a supranational entity, which is the European Central Bank. Now, let's look at why these people. Let's take the head of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, who is now blamed for the fiasco, and I hope that she won't recover from this political defeat. Now, Ursula von der Leyen was described in the Financial Times a few days ago in an interview as the closest you can get in Germany to a royal or to a royal family. I'm not. This is almost exactly the quote. And in fact, she comes from a very rich family, which was first a merchant family connected to Britain, and then became a financier and an aristocratic family. And her name, her family name is Albrecht. Her father was a German politician, and she married into a nobleman called von der Leyen. So the aristocracy, we are at the level of the aristocracy, not less than that. And let's look at another figure who has been very powerful and is still very powerful in this supranational system. And this is the former head of the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, who is a compatriot of mine, but I don't know if you can call him a patriot. I think his allegiance is more to Britain than anything else. But anyway, this is still news. It's another news because he had resigned 2 years ago from his 7 years mandate, which had expired at the European Central Bank. And a few weeks ago, he has been appointed as head of the Italian government. So he's the prime minister of Italy now. Now we have a banker's government in Italy led by Mario Draghi, the former head of the European Central Bank. Now, who is Mario Draghi? Mario Draghi, his importance worldwide is because he has been recognized as the man who saved the euro. He's famous for a press conference in 2011 where he said that the European Central Bank would do whatever it takes, this is a quote, to save the euro. And from that point on, the ECB started to pump massively liquidity into the banking system, and this does it today still, like the Federal Reserve. So he is described as the savior of the euro. But before that, his career started as an obscure official in the Italian Treasury. He was Director General. And in 1992, we exposed him, we as EIR, the Executive Intelligence Review, we exposed it because we published a report saying that in June 1922, Mario Draghi had joined a group of bankers and financiers from the city of London on board of Queen Elizabeth's yacht called the Britannia, the famous Britannia ship of Queen Elizabeth. This ship had come off the shores of Italy, and Draghi went on the ship to lecture the bankers of the city on how to privatize the Italian state-owned industry. Now, this was a strategy session, And after this, Draghi became the head of the privatization committee in the Italian government, and he held this post for 10 years, and he oversaw for 10 years the second largest privatization in Western Europe, the first one being the British one under Margaret Thatcher. So we exposed him in 1992. Actually, we exposed it a few months later in January 1993, and this became a big scandal in Italy. He had to go in front of Parliament to explain why he, as a government official, had gone on Queen Elizabeth's yacht to join this conference. And this has been a stigma on Draghi since then. Of course, EIR became very notorious at that point, and we have a big credibility with this since then. But he survived this, and he managed to privatize, which means sell out the entire state-owned industry in Italy, which means almost all the banks, almost all Italian banks were state-owned. So he privatized them. Then he privatized the giant state conglomerate IRI, which was steel, which was cement, which was shipyards, which was infrastructures, etc., etc. It was almost 1/3 of the Italian economy. And then he was rewarded. He left the treasury and he went to work for Goldman Sachs. He became deputy head of Goldman Sachs. Then he became head of the Bank of Italy. So from Goldman Sachs to Bank of Italy after 2 years. And from the Bank of Italy, he was appointed head of the European Central Bank, which he held for 7 years. I have known Mario Draghi personally because I used to go to press conference of the ECB, and I have a very, very bad memory of this because I caught him lying. I raised a question at the press conference asking him about his responsibility in liberalizing the Italian banking sector. And you must know that Italy, like most European countries, had a very regulated banking system in the post-war period, which was modeled more or less on the Glass-Steagall system in the United States. Our banking reform was done in 1936, so 3 years after Glass-Steagall. And it was done in a different way, but the net result was that commercial banks were not allowed to do anything else than commercial banking. And there was only one investment bank, and this investment bank had no protection whatsoever. So Draghi liberalized the system with a reform which carries his name at that time in the 90s. So I asked him a question. And this was a period where many people, many bankers publicly had regretted Glass-Steagall was cancelled in the United States. This was after the financial crisis, 2008 financial crisis. So I asked him, Draghi, if he wouldn't also regret the fact that he liberalized the banking system and he introduced the so-called universal bank in the country. And in the press conference, he lied. He said, well, I didn't eliminate banking separation because we didn't have, I didn't eliminate bank separation because we didn't have anything like Glass-Steagall in Italy. So he lied totally because in the official records of the Bank of Italy, if you go there and read the history of the bank, you can read that in 1930 was a banking reform which was modeled on Glass-Steagall. So now where does, I've spoken now a lot about Draghi, but where does he come from? Why did he get such a big career? And if you ask me, Draghi made the career he made thanks to his wife, who comes from an aristocratic family of Venice. Her name is Maria Serena Cappello. Now, the Cappello are a very old patrician family in Venice. They claim that they are as old as the Roman Empire. And if you know history, Venice was founded by members of the Roman Senate who escaped the ruins and the wars from Rome, the invasions, and established themselves in Venice. And so Draghi married this woman very, very early, and the Cappello family, being a Venetian patrician, they have the status of crown princes in the Holy Roman Empire. Now, if this sounds too old, like medieval, Middle Ages, or very far away, a long time ago in history, well, bear in mind that the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, existed until 1918 in Europe. And the power of these people exists still in form of financial power, because the background of the European aristocracy is they went from being warlords, feudal lords, into merchants, and then into financiers. So if you want to know where modern liberalism and modern central banking was born, it was in Venice. It was the Venice aristocracy, a merchant aristocracy, which then became a money aristocracy, that founded the first modern central bank. It was called the Fondo di San Marco. Now, Fondo is a diminutive of Fondaco. Fondaco is a basement. Why? Because the Venetian merchants, the Venice merchants, they had their wares in basements. And so the idea of a basement with merchandise and with stuff then became the idea of money, Fondaco, and Fondo became then the idea of a bank. And all these private fondi of the families then joined themselves in a common fund, which was the central fund called the Fondo di San Marco. Now, this is the Federal Reserve. It's exactly the same thing. The Federal Reserve is not a national bank, but it's the coming together of private banks. So from Venice, then this went to Amsterdam, and then went to Britain. And in Britain, the Venetians, they were so strong that it existed a so-called Venetian party in England at that time. I'm talking about the time of Henry VIII. Since Henry VIII upwards, the Venetians were the advisors of Henry VIII. And if you read Jonathan Swift, when Jonathan Swift describes the island of Laputa, the island that flies, the flying island, where people do everything wrong. They ruin agriculture, they ruin industry, they do everything wrong. And he says these people spoke a strange Italian dialect. So to me, this is a suggestion, knowing what the Venetian party was at that time, that Swift is exposing the pernicious policy of the Venetian party, of the Venetian oligarchy. So this is, So coming back to the concept, in other words, we are now ruled by a supranational state, which has taken all power from national parliaments and governments. All the laws which national parliaments approve in Europe are dictated from Brussels. In former times, there was even a debate on these rules that came from Brussels. Now they don't even discuss them. National parliaments have signed treaties, and members of the parliament even didn't read those treaties. So this is a situation now, and behind the people which are visible and who run the show, we have this money aristocracy, which which is the continuation of the old oligarchy. And I think I should stop for the moment, but maybe we can pick this up later. But one way they keep their political power is through mass culture, brutalized mass culture, which is used to control the population and prevent them to think. And then politically, they used to manipulate both the right wing and the left wing of political parties and create a counter gang scenario. I think this is important if we want to discuss it later because of the situation in the United States, where some extreme right-wing phenomena are used to attempt to criminalize the opposition to the oligarchy.
Okay, well, thanks a lot, Claudio. And what we're going to do is people should know if you have questions, you can ask your questions at questions@laroucheorganization.com. We put it up on the screen a few times and it's up there now. And we very much encourage that. What we're going to do is go to Harley now. Now, while it's highly likely that the global NATO scheme that we talked about at the beginning might very well fail when it comes confronted with the global reality of COVID, you also have the fact that there's a religious sort of movement going on right now, sometimes called the Great Reset. EIR, Executive Intelligence Review, has just released this report called The Great Leap Backward. LaRouche Exposes the Green New Deal. And so one of the things we want to do at this point is to talk again a bit more about the global strategic implications of this crazy Great Reset policy, also the American scene in that regard, and how the transatlantic European and American scenes are both being sort of powered by, on the one hand, this form of insanity, but at the same time are also ripe for a major change. So Harley, if you're there, I'm not seeing you on the screen right now. There you are. Excellent. Go right ahead.
Okay, thank you, Dennis, and hello, everyone. And Claudio, thank you for that very valuable and fascinating view of where these policies come from. People in the United States are highly suspicious of the European Union, but they're not clear why. And I think you gave people some real insight. Now, I'm going to take up something a little bit different, but it comes from looking at the same phenomena, how an oligarchy can run the world, or how they think they can run the world. Helga Zepp-LaRouche has been emphasizing that we are heading toward a danger of a new world war, which could be triggered either by some accident, like planes crashing as they're violating the airspace of others, or miscalculation. We could end up in World War III, possibly a nuclear war. Now, this is because of something called geopolitics and the geopolitical targeting of Russia and China. And that's what I want to discuss. Now, when President Trump ran for president in 2016, he was explicitly running against this geopolitical design. He made a great deal of talk about the importance of forming friendly, cooperative relationships with Russia, and then later he talked about with China as well. I think this is the reason he won in 2016. Because the American people were tired of war, they were tired of the endless wars, and Hillary Clinton was basically promising to not only continue the Bush and Obama policy, but to step it up. And Trump said he's going to end these wars and form cooperative relationships with Russia and China. And he said, what's wrong with being friends with Russia? Now, the problem is he was outflanked by the military-industrial complex. This was done through a number of things. First of all, Russiagate, which was run by the networks that control the military-industrial complex, British intelligence, the US intelligence under Obama, the media, who constantly attacked him. And if he said he wanted to talk to Putin, they said it's because he's a Putin puppet. Now, while Russiagate was targeting the possibility of Trump and Putin collaboration, you had a permanent bureaucracy in the government in the Defense Department, in the intelligence community, which were committed to a geopolitical confrontation with Russia and China, not friendship. You had both parties in Congress, even Republicans who at some points rose to Trump's defense in Russiagate. Nevertheless, they disagreed with him on Russia. They attacked Russia. People like Rubio, people like Cruz were constantly talking about the danger coming from Russia. And then you had the media. Now, some of you may know that last week we had a very interesting discussion at the Manhattan Project where Mike Robinson presented how the British networks were operating through BBC and Reuters, that they were functioning not as media, but as arms of British intelligence and arms of the Foreign Office. And so if you understand that, you can begin to get a sense of what we're up against here. Now, the problem with the policy that came into being with Trump, even as he was talking about working with Putin, talking about ending the endless wars, in 2018, you had the National Defense Strategy document, which said that Russia and China are adversaries and possibly enemies. They're aggressive, they have malign intent, and they are threatening the basic freedoms of the American people. And as Mike Robinson pointed out, this is the line that's coming from the media, but it's a line that the media is taking directly from, in the case of the BBC and Reuters, from the intelligence community of Britain. In the United States, the Washington Post gets it from the Washington Post is the leading promoter of this, but CNN, all of the media have this. And in fact, the media now has people from the deep state, like John Brennan and Clapper, as commentators on the media. And what are they pushing? They're saying we need to be reflecting a rules-based order, defending a rules-based order, human rights, democracy, the responsibility to protect. That's why we go to war. So you have these ironies. How is it that we're representing human rights when we destroy Iraq, we destroy Libya, destroy Syria? What human rights are those that we're defending? The human rights of ISIS and Al-Qaeda, who were armed and trained by people deployed by the Obama administration? That's the rules-based order? That's the human rights that supposedly reflect the views of the American people? And we're seeing this now continued in the Biden administration. You have Blinken giving a very strong attack on China, saying they don't respect the rules-based order. We make the rules. They're supposed to follow our rules. You have the bombing in Syria, which was illegal, done by Biden on February 25th. You have the Caesar sanctions against Syria, which are another false flag, a fake story about torture in Syrian prisons, which comes from where? From the British Media Project, the BBC, and others who are promoting this to use the same way they use the false flags of supposed chemical weapons use by the Assad government to cause Trump to bomb Syria. You have continuing war in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and you have a policy of starvation against the people of Yemen, against the children of Yemen, with sanctions, with arming of the Saudis and so on. Now, you also have NATO eastward expansion, and Claudio mentioned this, or maybe Dennis did. What does the Indo-Pacific region have to do with the North Atlantic Treaty Organization? So the question I want to take up is, why are we in these endless wars? What is it that causes this and who benefits from it? And in a word, it's geopolitics. Now, I'm going to give you a specific definition of geopolitics because many people throw the term around. They'll say things like, it's just the study of international relations. That's the geopolitical study. What do you think? People talk about geopolitical relations, about what's your geopolitical assessment? Well, there's a specific meaning to geopolitics, and it goes back in particular to the mid-19th century battle between Russia and Britain over the route from Afghanistan into India. Very specific. The British feared the Russian Empire would encroach on their empire. And so you had something called the Great Game. This included the Crimean War from 1853 to 56, where the British and the French went into the Black Sea to fight the Russians. There were Russian and British confrontations repeatedly in the second half of the 19th century in Afghanistan. And what was at stake here was India and Persia. Who would control them? Now, this was before people knew there was oil in Iran. So what was the issue? Now, the debate at the end of the 19th century then was between those people who were trying to figure out how to defend the power of the British Empire, which was a financial empire, a merchant empire, a banking empire, a looting empire, an empire that sent ships into China in the 1839 and 1859 to impose opium on the Chinese people because of the problems the British were having with their balance of payments. So this great game comes out of an economic fight, but specifically the fact that much of the world was moving toward an American system-style economic policy, including countries like Germany, France, Italy, Russia, Japan, which threatened the power of the British Empire. And more importantly, the rail policy, the transcontinental railroad that Lincoln initiated for the United States, was seen as a grave threat, because if you could do trade by land, it would undermine the power of the seas, which are much slower. Now, the first real salvo in this was shot by an American, Alfred Thayer Mahon, who wrote a book in 1890 called The Influence of Sea Power on History. I won't go through this, but you should take a look at it, because what he argues is that because of the way the world was, the geography of the world was constructed by God, there was a special power granted to the British island that could determine who would control the seas. Now, this debate was accelerated as Germany became a stronger industrial power, as Russia became was industrializing under Count Sergei Witte. And it led to a development in England, or I should say in Britain, around a man named Halford Mckinder, who was delivered a speech in 1904 to the Royal Geographical Society. And it was called The Geographical Pivot of History. Now, you hear the term pivot a lot now. This goes back to the British thinking that there were key pivot points in the world that would determine the outcome of the struggle between the empire and the potential emergence of republics. Remember, in 1900, Central Europe, Southwest Asia was dominated by four empires. You had the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you had the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and to some extent, the Prussian Empire, which was involved in this central fight from the standpoint of the British. The pre-World War I strategy of the British was to protect the sea routes to the Indian subcontinent, and that included controlling the Persian Gulf. Now, according to Mckinder's argument, the question of Eurasia was key to who would control the world, and he developed this more in his 1919 paper, Democratic Ideals and Reality, which I'll get to in a second. But essentially what he said is that you must drive a wedge between Western European powers and Eurasia, and also between European powers. And of course, World War I was the result of the British manipulation to form an alliance with France and then with Russia, the Triple Entente by 1907, against Germany. The fear was that if the German industrial grouping, which was based on, under Bismarck, based on Hamiltonian banking, Lincoln banking, American system economics, that if the Germans constructed railroads crossing Europe to Siberia, to Vladivostok, and from Berlin to Baghdad, that this would disrupt the control of trade by the British Empire. That was Mckinder's contribution in 1904. Now, what he argued then afterwards, in his second book, the Democratic Ideals and Reality, is that while this was the strategy before World War I, it was clear that the World War was won by British sea power. Now, this is just not true. Without an American intervention, that war could have continued much longer. But what he said is that it was the command of the sea that allowed the British to deploy troops to the continent, to move goods around the world, and eventually the naval blockade of Germany forced Germany, out of fear of starvation, to capitulate. Well, in fact, the naval blockade of Germany led to Germany attacking, reinitiating submarine warfare, which ultimately was the cause for the United States to get into the war. But the people in the United States were not so committed to the war in World War I. Wilson ran for president in 1916 under the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." But the fight of the British oligarchy through key financial institutions in the United States, through legal networks and other kinds of connections, was to bring the United States into the war in defense of the British Empire. Now, this becomes clear when you take a look at a paper that Mckinder wrote, actually a book, one that's not so well known, called The World War and After, which was, again, a paean to British sea power, but quite interesting. And I'm just going to review the key points here because if you think about it, you'll begin to get a sense of why we're still fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria and Libya and Somalia. That whole region is what Mckinder defined as one of the pivots in determining world history. Now, in World War I, he said it was necessary to outflank Germany by breaking Turkey, because Turkey was an ally of the Germans. And they wanted to take control of the Dardanelles Strait, which would cut off Germany to the Middle East. And this is why the British engaged in this futile and absolutely foolish war where they got beaten at Gallipoli. But what they feared is that if Germany maintained an alliance with Turkey and Turkey maintained some kind of military strength, then Germany could link Constantinople with Aleppo, with Damascus, and with Baghdad by rail. And what Mckinder said is that was the great threat to the British. Now, if you've seen the movie Lawrence of Arabia, there's just a little insight you can get from that. What was Lawrence deploying the forces of Sharif Hussein to do? Blow up railroads. That was the British policy. No rail connections on the Arabian Peninsula. Now, Mckinder said what happened in the battles and the deserts of the Arabian world would shape Middle Eastern politics, what we call the Middle East today, what was then known as Southwest Asia, and that's what it properly should be known as today. It would shape the political direction of that region for the next century. And this was the importance of such things as the Sykes-Picot Treaty, the secret agreement between Britain and France in 1916 to divide up the Middle East. Now, he also highlighted certain other events, and this is really crucial to understand British geopolitics today. He talked about the February 1917 revolution in Russia and what effect this had on the determination of British policy. There was the collapse of the Romanov dynasty, but Russia remained in the war, but it was weak. And then in the October Revolution, the Bolsheviks took Russia out of the war, which was an unhappy development for the Brits. But bringing the US into the war for Mckinder was key. Now, what he writes about in this book is in Central Europe, you had the collapse of the Prussian Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Romanov, and the Ottoman Empire. So what became crucial in his view was that British convinced the Americans to see that the post-war aims of Western allies, namely the British, should be the same as America. And if you look at NATO today, you see this is in a sense, the inheritance of Mckinder's doctrine. And he wrote that the Great War, World War I, should be a warning to Western powers to guard against allowing hostile powers to control Eurasia. Now, this brings us back to the famous maxim put forward by Mckinder in his Democratic Ideals and Reality: who rules Eastern Europe commands the Heartland, which the Heartland is essentially from from European Russia to the Pacific. Who rules the heartland controls the world island. The world island is North Asia, it's all of Eurasia, the Middle East, and Africa. And who rules the world island, he wrote, commands the world. And so, therefore, what's necessary is to prevent any alliance between East and West, to keep a division between Russia, China, the Eurasian countries, and Eastern Europe and Western Europe. That was the doctrine. And to use the Middle East as one of the pivots and use Asia as another pivot. Now, it's interesting because there were people who argued that, well, Mckinder's doctrine was outmoded because of air power. You no longer needed sea power. You had airplanes that could move troops, move goods, and this got rid of Mckinder's doctrine. But actually, from just doing a quick look at some of the books that have come out since 2017, for example, there's one by a guy named Leonard Hochberg, where he says, he wrote an article called Mckinder's Geopolitics, Political Perspective Revisited. And he said that while Mckinder's thesis was abandoned after World War II because of air power, it reemerged after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And then he's specific. He said Mckinder's conception of the heartland should be interpreted as, by reverse, the goals of Russia and China. That is, to use the power of Eurasia to conquer Europe, especially after the formation of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which was a Russian-Chinese economic organization that was committed to regional development. And his third point, then, is that the U.S. must return to the geopolitical ideals to respond to the attempted domination of the heartland by Russia and China. So it's not just the South China Sea. And why is this so important? Because what's the key enemy today, or the key threat coming from a Russian-Chinese alliance, a Eurasian perspective? What's the key threat? The Belt and Road Initiative. It's still the same thing. The ability to connect nations for the economic benefit of all the nations involved. What Lyndon LaRouche talked about before the Belt and Road Initiative was announced by Xi Jinping was the necessity of developing corridors of development. The importance of rail is not just for shipping. It's that along the lines you develop new cities, new capabilities to serve the transportation capability, that these are corridors of development that can extend east and west and north and south. And this is what the Chinese have intended to do with the Belt and Road Initiative, and which is the subject of 3 major reports that we've written under the direction of Mrs. LaRouche on the Belt and Road Initiative, or the Silk Road becomes the world, I forget the title now, but in any case, it's the idea that this is the key to global economic development. Now, why are we then fighting wars in the Middle East? It's not just about oil, because as I pointed out, this predates oil. What you're dealing with is this concept of spheres of influence. You're dealing with what some people call realpolitik, but which is actually geopolitics. The division of the world based on the primacy of sustaining the power of the City of London and its allies. Now, besides military buildup and wars, this is what you see the Great Reset representing. It's an attempt to subordinate every nation to supranational government, as Claudio was talking about what's being done in Europe today, to usurp the power of national governments, put it in the hands of a group, a conglomerate of cartels, have the policy of the laws that are written be determined by supranational courts, so that no nation has recourse if the policies of the international, the globalized system, go against the interests of their people. That's what the Great Reset is, to do that with banking, to take the financial power of the leading banks of the world and give them control over the spending power of nations. And if that happens, then why elect national parliaments or national governments or a Congress? If that power is taken away from them and put in the hands of technocrats who work for the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank or the Bank of England, then you have no say in your future. That's why the issue of sovereignty becomes important. But that's why the Mckinder doctrine was based on the idea of subordinating the interests of other nations to those of the British Empire, which would be the determining factor in what the so-called rules-based order is. And that rules-based order, well, George Herbert Walker Bush called it the New World Order. It wasn't so new when Bush proposed it. That was what Mckinder had in mind, how to sustain the global power of the British Empire, which is today represented by the City of London, Wall Street, Silicon Valley, the European Central Bank, and so on. And what is different about Russia and China, it's not just the Belt and Road Initiative. It's that they will not submit to the demands of the international bankers. And I'll just finish with this point. There was just a conference in China to lay out the strategy for Chinese economic development up to 2050. And what did they talk about? They didn't talk about windmills. They didn't talk about solar panels. They talked about the new technologies in energy, in extraterrestrial science that will provide the drive to the economy in the future. They're not talking about austerity. They're not talking about submission to bankers. They're talking about what Lyndon LaRouche called physical economy. And that's the alternative, either a world of sovereign nation states functioning on the basis of the physical economic needs of their populations versus a global empire that would impose a Green New Deal that would be a policy that would reduce the population of every nation on the planet. And that's why we have to understand that geopolitics is a doctrine which is still alive today and which is shaping international policy and which is a threat to every single person on the planet.
Okay, thanks a lot, Harley. Just before we go to discussion, we're going to just show, for purposes of a news flash, if you will, a few scenes of the rover Perseverance on Mars. I think some people are aware that the rover took its first steps a couple days ago, about 20 feet, moved about 20 feet. This is the Perseverance rover, the full machine, and then the next slide shows the footprints of the rover, showing that it is in fact ambulatory and is expected to move about 10 to 15 miles over the course of its mission. We also want to show you the view that the rover sees from Mars of the Milky Way. So this resolution is approximately what you would see if you were on the planet. The lenses of the rover mimic and almost they essentially approximate the way that your eye would see that same scene. So think of yourself as being in that position, not merely from the standpoint of Mars itself, but in that position looking at and thinking about what we mean when we talk about an extraterrestrial physical economy expressed in that rover. And the Chinese mission and the United Arab Emirates mission, let's remember, that are also going on right now at the same moment. There are three nations in dialogue on the and around the planet Mars right now. What we want to do now is go to our co-host here, Diane Sayre, is a candidate for U.S. Senate 2022, running against the senator from Wall Street, Chuck Schumer, and first see if Diane has some response to what she's heard from Claudio, Harley, Lynn, and otherwise.
Well, yes, what I've heard actually from both of you, and you may have comments on this, brought to mind something that Lynn wrote in 1999 in his platform, The Road to Recovery. And at one point he says, what is the change in principles of law which separates the feudal system of Europe prior to the mid-15th century from the emergence of the modern sovereign nation within the relatively precise time frame of the AD 1438 to 1492 period, out of the setting of the Great Ecumenical Council of Florence. And then he lists 4 points, which I think are very important, and I think people typically don't consider what a breakthrough the idea of a nation state was and its purpose actually. Number 1, he says, prior to the indicated AD 1438 to 1492 interval of fundamental change in the history of extended civilization, the dominant form of society of the Mediterranean and immediately adjoining areas was the imperial form characteristic of the Babylonian, Persian, Roman, and Byzantine empires, and also the continuation of the imperial form of oligarchical society as feudalism, of the imperial form of the anti-nation state globalization associated with the European Guelph League or Welf League War of AD 1239 to 1340. Second point, under all of these forms, in which the overwhelming majority of the population was subject to the status of actual or virtual human cattle, there was no rationality in law, nor regard for truthfulness in general or truthful justice in particular. The power to make law was restricted to the figure of an emperor or analogous figure, perhaps the social media today or the news media or whatever, the banks, who was appointed to that position by decision or tacit consent of the ruling oligarchy. 3, therefore, there was no principle of reason in law, but only the effort to maintain the appearance of deductive consistency among the different laws and decrees, as any combination of these might bear upon the same category of decision. Thus, even in modern society, the preference for positive law over natural law always reflects the influence of the oligarchical tradition in law in opposition to principles of justice and reason. And the 4th point, under the rule of the sovereign form of nation-state republic, the place of merely positive law was taken over by the notion of the general welfare, a notion interchangeable with the idea of a commonwealth in which the defense and improvement of the conditions of life of all of the people and territory of the nation and its posterity is the standard of accountability by which the truthfulness and truthful justice of the adopted law was and is to be judged. And I do think this conception is precisely what's under attack right now with this great reset. And I think clearly it's more or less conscious, and that there is a real throwback to this old feudal oligarchical system. But I think both Harley and Claudio may have more to say on that.
Yeah, let's just ask. Claudio, you have any comment or response or anything you'd like to say additionally at this point?
Well, I think that's pretty accurate. I mean, Great Reset is the same name. It's a new name of a process which has gone on for decades in its modern form. And in our last report, the EIR produced a report, the Great Leap Backward. I think the article by my colleague Freeman explained this. Well, I mean, this entire thing of the Great Reset is based on a great epistemological lie which produces the ideology of climate change. So the Great Reset is justified by the lie that the most urgent task for humanity is to stop climate change. And to stop climate change, we have to stop industrial emissions, because climate change is provoked by human activity. Now, there is no evidence for this. And you read in the media and you watch TV and you hear that scientists, or all scientists agree that we have to stop climate change and we have to do something to stop emissions. Now, this is also not true. There is a faction of pseudoscientists who have gathered together and are promoted by the oligarchy, who is pushing this. This is the International Panel on Climate Studies. But there is a large number of scientists whom we are in contact with who totally disagree and expose the fact that the entire notion of climate change provoked by human activity is based on pure hypothesis, on mathematical models which have been built on the basis of hypothesis. So basically, people have said, okay, let's give a percentage to what human activity impact on climate is, and then let's build models on this. It's models based, mathematical models, literally built on pure conjectures, on pure hypotheses, which are not at all verified. And for example, the solar activity, the activity of the sun, is very, very little represented in such mathematical models. So, in other words, the entire Great Reset policy aiming at deindustrialization, decarbonization, is based on a false scientific assumption. They are using false science, they're using mathematics, and they call it science. Now, Linda LaRouche has always made a polemic against this, a polemic against mixing mathematics with real science. Now, mathematics is a projection. It's what you describe in what Lyndon called the discrete manifold, what's going out in the universe, and mostly in a realm where our senses do not reach this realm. So real science is based on hypothesis on how the physical universe works, and then mathematics is, the closest approximation we can have of these principles. So we now to connect back to your remark. This is a product of the distraction of that achievement that Lynn describes in the passages that you read. Because that's the period when also modern science was created. Modern science is created together with the notion of the nation state in the Renaissance by Nicolas von Kues. And it's based on on a total unit of what in German is called Geisteswissenschaft, science of the spirit, and science of the nature. And what these people today do, they split this. They do, they are Aristotelian. They separate the activity they separate human creativity from the physical universe. This is liberalism. This is modern liberalism. This was invented by Paolo Sarpi, the guy who mastered the Council of Trento in the 16th century, modern liberalism. He said, okay, religion should take care of the spirit and should not interfere in science. Science should have its independence. So they separated science from human creativity. And in this sense, they basically separated man from the physical universe. So the authors of the Great Reset, the environmentalists today, they do exactly this. They say they put man outside of the universe, and they claim that man with this activity is in contradiction with the physical universe. So on one side you have nature, and then you have man coming from outside, disturbing nature, and therefore man must be suppressed. So LaRouche's idea and the real idea of man is an integral part of the universe. There is a very nice expression in Christianity, which says that man is the living image of God. Man is helping with his creativity God in the ongoing creation of the universe, and he does this with discovering physical principles and implementing them in improving the state of mankind on the earth and improving the earth at the same time.
Harley, if you have anything to say, fine. Otherwise, there's sort of a question that you were asked, and the nature of the question is they're asking whether you can illustrate or address your point about Halford, Mckinder, and geopolitics with maps. Now, we have a couple of maps that Dave's going to put up. They may or may not be helpful to you. This is a map of the area referred to as the Middle East. And if you can put up the next map, Dave. Now, this is a map we have, which I think is a little deceptive. This is supposedly U.S. military bases worldwide. But of course, we're also talking about the Anglo-American impact of this. So these are the two maps we had available, Harley. I don't know if you want to use either one of them or otherwise address what the concern is. I think the person just wanted to...
Let me come back to the second one on maps in a second, but I wanted to comment on what Diane read from Lynn. Because this is crucial, this question of feudalism, the question of the emergence of the modern Republican nation state out of feudalism and the contrast between the two. Let's go back to the comments that Churchill made that we had at the beginning about saying that we're united. The English-speaking peoples are united. We have a common basis in culture and law, I believe is what he said. Now, that's false. That is a complete lie, because the difference between the policies or the principle of government in the United Kingdom and the United States could not be more different. England, or Great Britain, is still a monarchy. It's based on certain feudal principles, private interests above the general welfare. This was the fight between Leibniz and Locke. And Lynn always refers back to Leibniz as the philosopher and scientist who developed the concept of physical economy, which shaped the thinking of Franklin, Benjamin Franklin, Hamilton, and others of our founding fathers. This is why our Declaration of Independence talks about life, liberty, and happiness, as opposed to life, liberty, and property, which the Lockeans wanted. That was the North Carolina Constitution, was a Lockean constitution, which had defense of property. But the founding fathers reversed that or changed it to pursuit of happiness, which is a Leibnizian concept that by doing the work of God, of being creative and transforming the world, that's what makes you happy, and that's what government should encourage, and that's part of the general welfare. So I think the question of the special relationship that Churchill put forward is a fraud that has continued to dominate the relationship between the United States and Great Britain to the present. And that's what we see when you hear talk about the rule of law. As I pointed out in my presentation, what law, what universal law is the United States following under Bush with the war on terror, where we bomb countries and destroy nations? What about Obama with his attacks on Libya and the overthrow of the elected government in Ukraine? How can we say we're for democracy when we're involved in overthrowing democratically elected governments, possibly including our own? So when you look at this, you see the absolute distinction between what the Diane read from Lynn and what is represented by the special relationship. Now, if I could just have the second map again, I can make a brief point, but I think this is something that people really have to take a look at. If you look on the map, you look at the two largest expanses. You have North America and you have Eurasia. And the question, and then you take a look at the world of Western Europe, how small it is geographically, and yet how it was able to dominate South America, Africa, what's called Oceania, that is Australia, New Zealand, the Indian subcontinent. You know, the greatest expanse of the British Empire was not in the 18th or 19th century, it was in the early part of the 20th century. And much of what happened in the middle of the 20th century, especially after World War II, was a turning back of the colonialism, the throwing the European powers out of countries, only to have them come back and control it through financial means. But essentially what Mckinder was saying is that if you look at what's available in the great expanse of Russia, which is at the top on the right-hand side of the map, combine that with China in terms of people, in terms of raw material potential, economic potential, and then extend it through the bridge between Eurasia and Africa, which is the Middle East, and also the Middle East to some extent is a bridge through the Mediterranean into Southern Europe. That represents a potential. If you have sovereign nation states collaborating, it becomes impossible for no matter how much financial power in terms of money exists in the British Empire and their American lackeys, it doesn't have the capability to impose its will. That's why the Great Reset ultimately won't work. If Russia and China and other nations go against it, then and then you have an opposition to it because of the idiocy of the Green New Deal. And then on top of that, you have the mentality of the people pushing it. They're thieves. They're talking about competing for $30 to $40 trillion between government, central bank created money, private money, equity funds, and so on, competing for $30 to $40 trillion in the Green New Deal. They're going to cut each other's throats. We already saw that with the GameStop, which was not the little guys against the big guys. There were big guys on both sides. These guys will claw each other to death to get their piece of that 30 trillion. So between the internecine battles on Wall Street and the City of London, plus the opposition of great powers, the ultimate determination will be what happens in the United States. Unfortunately, Biden, or whoever's actually sitting in power in Washington, is committed to the Green New Deal and the Great Reset. But I think that's something that can be defeated, and that's what we have to defeat if we're going to prevent World War III and a total global depression collapse.
Okay. Diane, I think you have a question or a couple questions there.
Yes, I do. Actually, I'm going to go to one for Claudio, which came in from Ernest in New Jersey. He asks if you could please discuss the significance of Transaqua and who in Italy is supporting this program.
Thank you. Well, Transaqua has been described as the single infrastructure project that could become the locomotive of the recovery of the entire Africa, of an economic boom for entire Africa. It's basically the idea that came to a group of Italian engineers in the 70s who were active in Africa, and this was at the time when the first severe drought was threatening the life of Africans in the Sahel. And the Lake Chad, which was a big lake of sweet water in the middle of the Sahel, had been reduced to 1/10 of its entire dimensions. And the idea was developed to go south into the Congo River basin, which is plenty of water that goes through with the Congo River, which is the second largest river in the world. It's entirely wasted into the Atlantic Ocean. The idea came, how can we get some of this water and bringing to north to the Sahel region and replenish the lake, and so guaranteeing life and development for millions of Africans. It's estimated that at least 30 million of Africa would benefit if this is done. So out of this, they started to work, and then they realized that they could build a canal that could bring enough water from the Congo basin to the Lake Chad basin entirely per gravity, so downhill. And they could do, this could be done by starting in the southern region of Congo, near the Kivu region, near the Great Lakes region, on the hills, and starting from the first tributaries of the right side of the Congo River, so not going down to the river itself, but going from uphill, crossing all the tributaries going north, and each time you cross a tributary, you build a dam, and you create a reservoir. So you go to the next river, you build another dam, and then the next reservoir. So if you go up like this, and you reach the Central African Republic, you are in the Congo, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and then you go north, then you are in the Central African Republic, and that's a watershed. You arrive to a point where it's maybe 500 meters high. It's a watershed, and beyond the watershed, then you go downhill to Lake Chad, and there is a river that goes, a small river that goes to Lake Chad. It's called the Chari River. So it's you could build up to almost 30 dams if you do this, and you can create a canal by connecting all these reservoirs with navigable canals. They calculated that you can build a canal which is 100 meters large and 10 meters deep. And you do this entirely per gravity. You bring down the water per gravity, and you take, maybe a total of 5-7% of the total water that goes into the Atlantic Ocean through the Congo River, and you can replenish Lake Chad. Not only, half of the water you use to replenish the lake, and the rest you use for agriculture, for irrigation, for anything. Now, each time you build a dam, of course, you can produce electricity. So you can produce an enormous amount of electricity going upwards to Lake Chad. And at the end, you have a big transport infrastructure, a canal which can be totally, long, a total of 2,400 kilometers long, entirely navigable. So this is a tremendous transport infrastructure. Then you have production of electricity. Then you have agriculture. You can develop agricultural land for a surface which is as large as the Italian region of Lombardy, and you regulate all these rivers. So this is something that should be obvious. All reasonable people in the world look at this and this. Oh, we have to do this. Africans want this. Now, it was, as I said, it was developed as the initial concept in the 70s, and in the 80s, the Italian company that had done this study, its name is Bonifica, was promoting this worldwide. But then the campaign was stopped because the conglomerate, the owner, was privatized. It was privatized in the context of those privatization I mentioned at the beginning. Bonifica was part of the conglomerate called IRI. So in the 90s, under Mario Draghi and his group, IRI was privatized and Bonifica was sold. And my friend Marcello Vichi, who was the head of the engineers of the Transaqua project, he went personally to save all the records and all the books and all the studies they have done. Otherwise, they would have burnt everything. Now, we started a campaign for this when we were briefed about it, about this period already when it was privatized. And Linda LaRouche said immediately, this is a very good idea, we should promote it. So in several phases we promoted this, and then I finally came to meet Marcello in about 10 years ago, and we became friends, and then we worked together, and he joined us in relaunching this campaign. And as a result of this campaign, we succeeded in organizing the Lake Chad Basin Committee in 2018. This work was done also by my colleague Larry Freeman in the United States. He contacted the LCBC officials, and then they came over to Europe, and we met together. We met once in Rome, and then another time in Paris. And there is, as a result of these negotiations, then the head of the LCBC, whose name is Abdullah Sanusi, he organized an international conference on Lake Chad, where the participant countries, all the members of the Lake Chad Basin Commission, they endorsed Transaqua as the only feasible project to replenish Lake Chad. Now, since then, things have occurred. We succeeded in organizing the Italian government, in promising some money for the feasibility study, but the money has not come yet because there has been a government crisis in Italy. At the same time, there has been a counter mobilization. So I suspect that some African countries there have been counter organized. So the thing has not really moved on until very recently. About 3 months ago, last year in December, the former Italian Prime Minister Romano Prodi, suddenly he was invited at the conference on Lake Chad in Turin, and suddenly he make a very forceful intervention for Transaqua, saying we have to build this because this is the solution to the crisis in Africa. Hundreds of thousands of people are emigrating from Africa, are fleeing from the Sahel region and from other regions of Africa because of wars, because of poverty, because of terrorism, or whatever. But the solution is not to have these people come to Europe or to the West and leave their countries. The solution is to go there and build development. And Transaqua is the key for this because it would mobilize enough energies, enough manpower, enough economic activity to become a locomotive for Central Africa and beyond Central Africa. Now, Prodi said, and I was astonished, I was surprised because in the past he had been very skeptical about it. Prodi said that we have to build an international lobby to implement this. And this must include the Africans through the African Union, must include the European Union, must include the United Nations, and must include China. So I was really positively surprised by this. And he stressed this, that we must include China because China has also the resources, it means money, to help build this. So this has reopened, I think, has reopened the perspective, because this is a new player. He represents part of the establishment, which so far had been skeptical about Transaqua. So let's see how this develops. But the importance of Transaqua goes beyond the mere idea of replenishing Lake Chad and recreated living conditions there. As I said, is an infrastructure that could become the pivot of the industrialization and recovery of the entire Africa, because it's a north-south transport infrastructure from the Central African Republic, which will be then connected to the Great Lake region, basically. A north-south connection can be built going to North Africa through Libya to the northern coast of Africa, and then southwards to Cape Town. At the same time, it can also be intersected by an east-west corridor. So we have basically the idea of building up a corridor, a north-south corridor of Africa that then can be projected towards Europe. And we have a big discussion in Europe about transport corridors which are being built, etc. And one of them is the north-south corridor going from the Baltic to the Mediterranean. And the southern part of this has to be built. The southern part has to involve southern Italy and North Africa. And the idea is, there are already modern railway connections from Northern Europe down to Central Italy, down to Salerno, which is actually southern Italy, but then they stop there. So the idea is to create in southern Italy a platform to develop Africa, and this can be done through a system of ports, airports, and transport roads and railways connections. And there are two key points in this. One is the connection between Sicily and Italy with a bridge, the famous Messina Bridge, and another one, which sounds futuristic, but it's perfectly feasible, is a bridge or a tunnel between Sicily and Tunisia. Now, this can be done. Yes?
Sorry, we have very many questions, so maybe you could quickly wrap up and go tell us where to go find all these details.
Well, you can find out in one of the reports that Harley mentioned, the land bridge reports, which we have published.
Great. Yeah, I would really encourage people to go. Thank you for that, because it does put it in context. And goodness, well, it gets me to a couple of questions which I think are relevant. One is on the Belt and Road from New York. Alvin writes, if my understanding is correct, today the unstoppable Belt and Road of China has now reached agreement on development projects with Pakistan. India has expressed objections to such projects. What role did the British Anglo establishment play in the splitting of India? Such a creation must have had a physical, geopolitical purpose to prevent precisely what China intends to accomplish in the near future. So, Harley, you want to say anything about that?
Sure. I think Alvin knows it's obvious that the India-Pakistan was the former Indian subcontinent, which was a British colony for several hundred years. And it was only released because of the mobilization of Gandhi and the Indian people. But what was done shortly after that was to split it between a predominantly Muslim nation, which became Pakistan. And of course, there were there was East and West Pakistan initially, separated by India. And then you had India, which has a large Muslim population, but which, during the Cold War, you had India somewhat siding with Russia, Pakistan with China, the United States very much involved with Pakistan. And so it's been when you talk about the geopolitics, one of the things that's being pushed is to call this area between the Indian Ocean and the Central Pacific, the Indo-Pacific region, where they're talking about setting up a new military alliance, either as part of NATO or separate from NATO, the so-called Quad, which would bring in Australia, India, and so on. So the positive news is that the Indian and Chinese military have been meeting recently, and they pulled back from the confrontation that was taking place in the still undetermined border area. But I think you can be certain that there's British influence on both sides in this, and it's aimed at stopping the Belt and Road Initiative. If there's one thing that the British geopolitics is aimed at right now, it's disrupting the Belt and Road Initiative, whether they call it a debt trap, whether they call it Chinese imperialism, whatever they call it, the Xinjiang fake human rights issue. What they're trying to do is to stop China from demonstrating that a nation can develop its own country and still be a cooperator in the development of other nations. And that's what China's doing with the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is a threat to the international monetary system. And also because it's a commitment to development, which means we don't have to kill people to save the environment. We can actually improve the environment with new technologies, with scientific advance, with research and development. One of the things the Chinese announced at this meeting a couple days ago in their discussion of the plans for 2050, that to improve the scientific development in China, they're going to devote 7% of their budget to research and development, which begins to get into the area that Lyndon LaRouche said is necessary for economies to develop. Lynn said at least 5%, as much as 10%. The Chinese are now committed to a 7% investment into new technologies. So I think that's why the British are so upset about China.
Great. And I think 10% in culture, which is really something hard to imagine. Now, here I'm going to have two questions, which I think both of you, on the COVID question. I think, Claudio, you were getting at this at the beginning, but someone's asking, is there a connection between the European Union and the slow deployment of COVID-19 vaccines in countries such as Spain, Italy, France, and Germany? You may want to touch on that again. And then in the United States, from New Jersey, a question, hearings held here in New Jersey on why COVID-infected patients were moved from hospitals to nursing homes, causing huge numbers of unnecessary deaths, much like what occurred in other states, or the collapse of energy in the Southwest United States because of non-scientific attempts to force the adoption of those quote-unquote environmental global policies, are just reflections of that same policy of forcing geopolitical policies that don't take into account the murderous outcomes of these policies. And the person is asking for a human solution. So,
why don't you take the first one, Claudio?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, well, of course, there is a connection. I mean, I'll give you again the figures of the availability of vaccines in Europe and in other countries. I mean, at the present state of things, we have in Europe 8 doses of vaccine for 100 persons. 8 doses for 100 persons. In the United States, it's 23. In the UK, in the United Kingdom, I mean, the British system is what it is, but when they do something right, we have to recognize it. So they have 31 doses per 100 persons. And in Israel, they have 95 doses per 100 persons. Now, this is a total failure. So the reason why this is the campaign, the vaccine campaigns go so slow, it's exactly because of this, because there are not enough vaccines. And there are not enough vaccines because the stupid European Commission did not order them in redundance without thinking about what it costs. Because whatever a vaccine can cost, and maybe if at the end of the day you are left with half of the vaccines because you ordered too many, whatever this costs, to cure people in the hospitals costs much more, and without talking about the casualties and the deaths. I mean, the last figures I saw for my country, they show that there was a surplus of death of 100,000 people last year because of COVID. This is tremendous, and it goes on. So every day which is late in vaccinations means more deaths. Now, you don't need to vaccine all the people to stop people from dying. Already, the campaign in Britain and Israel have collapsed the number of people infected and needing hospitalization. So, but as I said before, this is because of ideology and mentality. You know who is the official whom Mrs. von der Leyen put in charge of the European vaccine campaign? Is a woman. Her name is Gallina, which in Italian means hen. And the poor woman, she knows nothing about vaccines, about health, nothing. She has been trained as a translator. She's a translator by profession, and she has worked in the European Commission as a translator, and then she was moved to higher posts, etc. So she became a director somewhere, and this woman has been put on top of the vaccine campaign. And she said, one thing that she said, which I saw, was, you have to care of many things when you plan this campaign, including costs. So this is the thing. Now, of course, this has to change. Now we are late because what we need is to increase production. To increase production means to make investments, and it takes some time. Not all countries are able to do it, but this must be done now. But many, the entire approach of the European Union on the pandemic has been wrong from the beginning. They should have adopted the Asian model. And I'm not saying the Chinese model. I say the Asian model, because we have the Chinese model, we have the South Korean model, Japan, etc., and they all have something in common. That common health comes before individual liberty. And in Europe, we have not accepted this. In Europe, we have a thing, in Europe, we are all worshippers of a goddess called privacy. So goddess privacy has to be respected. And therefore, it was not possible in Europe to introduce tracing, to do what the Koreans and the Chinese and the Japanese have done, with apps that work. It was done with an app on a voluntary basis, which doesn't work. I have this app. I never got anything through this app, nothing. And it's impossible because, I went into supermarkets where people are, and I must have crossed somebody who was positive. So it doesn't work. And so lockdowns were done, but not really, lockdown have to be enforced. So you have to really be strict when you make a lockdown. There have been no really strict lockdowns in Europe. And the result is that, 1 year ago, we started with this, halfway measures, and then a soft lockdown, and then everybody free. And then again, the curve goes up, and then again, another lockdown. And then the thing stabilizes. Hospitals get half stabilized. Then we open again. and then the curve goes up. So we are still again at square one in Europe, and this is a total disaster.
Thanks. Harley, you may have some. I was just thinking that, Americans may be into their privacy when it comes to COVID tracking, but they don't seem to be that upset if Bloomingdale's or McDonald's knows every time they're driving by one of their stores. We all get these obnoxious announcements, but Harley, go ahead.
Well, I want to take up the question on the parallel between the COVID situation and the Texas shutdown of the electricity grid. In both cases, one of the words that came out was unprepared. We were unprepared for it. And so mistakes were made. And the person who asked the question was very polite in ignoring that Andrew Cuomo is the center of the attack in New York for the one who took people from the hospitals and put them into the nursing homes. And apparently that was a cause of a great number of deaths. But what did it mean to be unprepared? President Trump initially addressed this by saying that the takedown of public health that occurred under the Bush administration and then under Obamacare had a great deal to do with it. Well, it was privatization. The decision was made to increase the profit of private companies, whether it's big pharma, for-profit hospital associations, and so on, which meant that there was austerity, there was cutbacks, the idea of redundancy, which was built into the Hill-Burton system, the American medical tradition, was thrown out the window in the last 30, 40 years. And as a result, as a pandemic hits, we don't have materials, we don't have the physical equipment, we don't have the extra ability to bring in trained nurses and didn't have ventilators, didn't have all sorts of things. Well, the same thing is true in Texas. Privatization and deregulation is the part of the story that's not being told much. Now, it's really important that we make the point that the Green New Deal, the model for the Green New Deal was the solar panels and windmills in Texas, which failed. There's no way around that. And all these greenies who are running around saying, oh, it wasn't the windmills that was the problem. Yes, it was the windmills. That was almost 20% of the drop in electricity. But it was almost 90% of the windmill power was lost. And when you do that, when you have that, it puts a strain on the whole system. But then secondly, even in the coal fire, the gas, and others were hurt by the deregulation of electrical power distribution in Texas, in which you had companies that offered such low rates, the only way they could justify those rates would be by not making repairs, not keeping up maintenance, not winterizing. So in both cases, in the unpreparedness to deal with a medical catastrophe, same thing with other natural disasters like hurricanes and things of that sort. And then also with the electrical power situation in Texas, which, by the way, the same thing happened in California last summer because of heat emergencies. When you deregulate a system and you cause competition and profit motive to determine what's done, then you're not going to have the redundancy that's necessary when you have an emergency, when you have a crisis. Now, the idea that somehow we can just get by and that the profit is enough to cover us, and that, well, if 40 people die, that's collateral damage, that's unacceptable. If we actually prize human life, then the idea of a regulated system when it comes to electricity, when it comes to healthcare, and when it comes to banking is part of the general welfare as opposed to the profit motive for the billionaires. And I think that's the thing that connects these tragic situations.
Great, thanks. So due to time constraints, I have one more question that I'd like Harley to answer, and then Claudio and Harley, both of you, if you would have concluding remarks after that. Harley, I think this is important just because so many Americans are confused about what to do and have various ideas. And the question is on the role of the National Guard. He says, what role does the National Guard, parentheses, militia, as per the Second Amendment, play in preserving the American system and the rights of that. Would any petition have been answered with anything less if you didn't have the backstop of the Second Amendment? Would it not stand to reason then that regaining the National Guard is priority number one? The rationale to educate the public, have free press, free assembly, judicial corruption, war crimes in order to maintain the republic, that the founders were correct. And then writes, Shays' rebellion exemplifies that tyranny of usury only fails under force, the only thing proven to work. So I think it would be very useful if you would address this.
That's a lot of questions there in that short paragraph. Look, let me go at it a slightly different way, because right now we're told the National Guard has been asked to stay an extra 2 months, and what's the reason for that? Well, they're trying to hype up the idea that there's a great, vast right-wing militant grouping of gun owners and racists and Trump supporters who, if you didn't have the National Guard there, would storm the Congress again and start shooting people and destroy the country. I mean, this is part of the false flag of January 6th, the idea that you create this image of American citizens, many of whom were in Washington because they were concerned by what they saw or what they thought were irregularities in the vote count. And in a free society, people have a right to protest. They have a right to speak out. Instead, we're getting censorship. And the question at this point is, what is the purpose of deploying the National Guard? Well, we have a tradition in this country of not using the U.S. military for domestic operations unless there's an emergency, like an insurrection act is declared or something. So in this case, you have a combination of, I would say, a breakdown in intelligence, because the intelligence is buying into this line that you have a large number of people who are out to overthrow the government. And then at the same time, you have the deployment into both left and right, as Claudio was talking about gang counter gang, that you have deployment of government operatives, of security agencies, of intelligence agencies into the different groups, whether it's Black Lives Matter, Antifa, Proud Boys. You know, we've seen some of this emerge recently in the press. I'm sure there's a lot more to say. And if you go back and look at what happened, the precedent for this in the 60s and 70s, with the COINTELPRO operations against the anti-war movement, with the deployment into the Klan to blow up buses to stop desegregation, you find government agencies, especially the FBI, involved in these kinds of things. And so there's obviously an effort being made to ramp up the sense of threat so that the National Guard is being deployed to do what? To stop an insurrection? Well, you know, the use of a National Guard has, I think, its best purpose when you look at catastrophes, and the Guard is sent in as first responders, sometimes when there's flooding, when there's hurricanes and things of that sort. But the Constitution does establish the right to have an organized militia, and that's to defend the country. And I think that's the purpose of the National Guard. Now, beyond that, the other questions that were posed in this, look, all of this comes to a point that we're having a breakdown of society, not just in the United States, but as Claudio was pointing out, the European Union. In many countries around the world, governments are incapable of protecting and defending the needs of the people. And this is because we've gone off the deep end into neoliberal economic policy, in which corporate cartels are granted the power to make the policy over and above governments. And these cartels are driven by one thing, which is shareholder value, how to increase the profits to the most powerful shareholders, the Bezos and the people of that sort, the Bill Gates, who run their corporations for the sake of personal profit. Same thing you have with the banks, where the policies that were part of the mortgage-backed security collapse in 2008, the everything bubble today, while most of the population is suffering from these policies, the people running them, the speculators, who are basically speculative swindlers, are making out famously at the expense of the population because we don't have a regulated system. And this is why LaRouche's 4 laws are so important. Everything that we're looking at in terms of the breakdown of our system, the systemic collapse of Western society, has been the result of the use by the oligarchy of methods of destroying education, destroying redundancy in public services, in deindustrializing and using fake science to convince us that we're the scourge of the planet, that human beings are destroying nature. And I had the other day one of my son's friends, a 6-year-old, telling me that we're destroying nature and what we should be doing is not having houses but living outside. And it was about 10 degrees at the time. And I said, "Are you prepared to live outside tonight?" And he said, "Oh, no, not me." I mean, how do you tell a 6-year-old that he's destroying the universe the way Greta Thunberg and others are? So we've got to get back to science. We've got to get back to real economics. And we've got to get back to this idea that is so important to the Schiller Institute of a cultural renaissance, so that we actually realize that what we value in each other is the creative potential, not that we see everyone as a competitor in a jungle trying the war against each against all. No, we have to collaborate. We have to figure out how to do that. It's going to be a real fight because we're in the midst of war danger and economic breakdown, pandemic, and so on. But unless we start with that, there's no way to solve these problems.
Thanks, that's excellent. So, Claudio, do you have some parting thoughts, concluding remarks?
Yeah, 2 minutes, 3 minutes.
Yeah, that's about, yes.
Okay. And there's a
2
lot
minutes
that can be
Italian time.
there's a lot that can be said. I mean, Harley gave me one cue, which I also mentioned at the beginning, which we should talk about maybe in one of the next occasions. But we have a EIR and the LaRouche movement has gained a big authority and competence on the question of international terrorism, how this counter gang thing works in order to control nations. And one big breakthrough which we did was in 1978 when the Italian political leader Aldo Moro was assassinated in Italy by the Red Brigades, so-called left-wing terrorists. This was a terrible period. And this was really a paradigm shift with this assassination. Afterwards, everything changed in Italy and in the Mediterranean area, which means also North Africa. But we made a breakthrough under Lynn's direction because we discovered in our work, in our research on who was behind this operation, we discovered how the oligarchy works. We discovered that this left-right thing is not reality. We discovered that behind the leftist factions who were backing or were sympathetic to insurrectionists, to the left-wing terrorists, were the same oligarchy who was on the right wing calling for death penalty and police state against insurgency. So we made a real breakthrough. And interesting because we singled out one particular oligarchy family. The right wing was very well known at that time, the Pallavicini, the Colonna, etc. But the left wing was little known, and we've singled out one, which is the Caetani family. And the Caetani family, Moro was found dead inside a car in front of their palace. And after many years, Italian intelligence has found out that this family or members of this family were really involved in somehow playing a role in the assassination and in control of terrorism. Now, this is ironic because, this is the 700th year of the death of Dante Alighieri, the famous poet, the guy who invented the Italian language and invented the Italian nation. And, in his biggest opera, the Commedia, that many of you might know and might have read something about it. He makes of the Pope of that time, it was his personal enemy, and he was a Caetani, and he's the only guy who was still alive when Dante puts him in the Inferno. Dante puts a lot of people in the Inferno who had died already, but this guy, Pope Caetani, Bonifacius VIII, he was still alive when Dante put it in the Inferno. Or he had someone saying, we expect this guy is coming to join us. So this is a continuity. But let me conclude with one proposition, positive proposition. The power of the oligarchy is based on money. It's based on the financial system, and the financial system is on the verge of blowing out. It has reached such a point of instability that there can be a collapse every day now. And, we must be ready to intervene as we did in 2008, but unfortunately not successful enough. Again, with LaRouche's furlough, starting with shutting Wall Street and reintroduce Glass-Steagall. Had President Trump done what he had promised in the election campaign, had he introduced Glass-Steagall, he would have smashed his enemies. They wouldn't have had the financial power and to do the Russiagate or to conduct election fraud. So let's mobilize and let's be prepared for getting this thing through.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Harley, did you have more thoughts?
Well, I think I said what I wanted to say, but I definitely want to endorse what Claudio just said. Take the power away from the enemies of this country. When people say, what can we do? What can we do? Glass-Steagall would force the banksters to eat their bad debt. No bailouts, no bail-ins, and no bail for the criminals running the system. And I think that's the solution.
Great. Well, thank you both. I have a few announcements. One thing I did want to announce, which many of our watchers probably are aware of, but to reiterate, Mrs. LaRouche has put out a press release with the title, Why LaRouche PAC No Longer Represents the Policies of Lyndon LaRouche. And in it, she states that through counsel, she has issued a letter to the Lyndon LaRouche Political Action Committee and its treasurer, Barbara Boyd, demanding that they, quote, immediately cease and desist, both now and in the future, unquote, from, quote, using Mr. LaRouche's name, likeness, and potentially other confusingly similar terms, unquote. That this use is, quote, likely to cause confusion among consumers since they may believe that you, Barbara Boyd as an individual and LaRouche PAC and or the goods and services being offered are somehow associated with, licensed or authorized by our client Helga LaRouche, unquote. And the remedies required are that they, LaRouche PAC, immediately take all necessary actions to change the name of your political action committee and the name of any affiliated entities to a name that does not include the term Lyndon LaRouche or any formative or iteration thereof. So I just wanted to say that because it should be clear to the supporters of Lyndon LaRouche and the legacy of Lyndon LaRouche where things stand, and therefore the significance of the LaRouche organization and the Schiller Institute. Otherwise, I would like everyone to know that you can visit LaRouche Pub, as in publications.com, to purchase a copy of the report exposing the fraud of the Great Reset called The Great Leap Backwards. LaRouche exposes the Green New Deal. And to tell all of you, and I'm glad Claudio mentioned the 700th anniversary of the death of Dante, because on March 20th and now 21st, I believe, the Schiller Institute will be holding an international conference online. It will be 2 panels on Saturday and likely to be one on Sunday morning, March 20th and 21st, on the whole global strategic situation, and the conference will begin with a panel on culture, the question of Dante, the question of dialogue of civilizations, the role of this, the important role of culture in disaster or success at dealing with things. The next panel will be on the global strategic situation, and the final panel on Sunday on various aspects of the both crisis and potential in Southwest Asia. So I'd urge everybody to set that weekend aside. And I would like to thank you for joining us this afternoon, and we will see you. Oh, and for those of you wondering, Dennis Speed had another pressing engagement for which he had to leave, but nothing terrible has happened to him, and you'll see him next week. So thank you very much for tuning in.